How did I balance marriage, fatherhood, and a demanding career? Well, I stopped wasting time. That helped a lot. I stopped drinking. I stopped going to bars. I really didn't spend a lot of time with my friends when I had young kids in particular. I had friends and I saw them, with some degree of regularity, but where I cut corners was more with social life outside my family. So I spent a lot of time with my wife, and I spent a lot of time with my kids, and I spent a lot of time on my career. And so you have to make choices. And I think those were reasonable choices. I'm not displeased with them. Don't abandon your friendships, but you can certainly look at where you're wasting time and just stop doing things that you know to be a waste of time. So, and I did. And so I had enough room for my marriage, and I had enough room for my kids, and I had enough room for my career, and, sort of a multi-dimensional career. And it was always a challenge to me too, to see how efficient I could get. And you can also, and I've really recommended this for relatively higher income, dual income couples who are trying to pursue dual careers, kids, and a marriage. You can outsource, hire a cleaning lady if you can afford it. Buy restaurant food if you can afford it, etc. You can outsource. You can have someone do your laundry. Then you can concentrate on your marriage and your kids. I know that is only an avenue available to people who have relatively high incomes, but people who have dual incomes have relatively high incomes. And so outsource what's unnecessary so that you can concentrate on what's necessary. I mean, I didn't do that when I was beginning my career, because when I lived in the United States, when I was in my late 20s and starting my family, we had one income. You'd think a Harvard beginning professor makes a lot of money, and I suppose that's true in some absolute sense, but relatively speaking, we didn't have enough money to buy magazines. We all our money went for housing cost and the basic necessities of living. I had a car that was 20 years old, 25 years old, I think. It was old. It was a bloody thing. The doors fell apart on the person I sold it to, like 6 months down the road. They knew it was a wreck at that point, but we drove that thing right into the ground. So I know that's not necessarily possible for everyone at the beginning of their career, but if you have two incomes, you can manage it. I concentrated on my marriage and making time for it. I concentrated on spending time with my kids consciously, and I concentrated on developing my career. Those were the three elements of my life. And I had some time left over for creative pursuits and for friends, but most of it was a matter of getting rid of time wastes of any sort, and I just pushed that out of my life, day after day until I wasn't wasting any time. You have to set up your vision, like Geppetto when he's looking at the star before Pinocchio's transformation takes place. You have to set up your long-term vision. You have some vision of the good towards which you're working, and some vision perhaps of the hell that you're avoiding. And then I would say, once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. And instead of, many people say, well, I hate using a schedule, or I hate using a calendar. And what I would say about that is that if you hate using a schedule or a calendar, then you're probably using it wrong. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplish, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. I plan my day obsessively. My calendar is always absolutely full and often weeks in advance. And I plan in the morning, especially when I'm on top of things. And I plan each hour, and I probably plan each minute. And yes, it leads to way higher productivity. You decide what your goals are going to be. You place them in the calendar. Use the calendar as your friend, because what you want to do with the calendar is design a day that you want to have, or a day that would be good for you. And a day that would be good for you is one that you're when you end the day, you feel that you've moved yourself ahead towards your valued goals, and that you've kept chaos under control. And that enables you to sleep soundly and with a good conscience, and to know that the next day is going to be at least not worse than that day. Planning is unbelievably useful. You need to figure out what it is that you're aiming at and why, and then you need to figure out how you're going to break that down over the months and the weeks and the days. But I would approach your calendar like it's your best friend. You think, okay, I'm going to design a week, man, that I really want to have. And that means you can schedule in leisure and all the things that you want to do, which you absolutely should do. Learning to plan is unbelievably useful, to schedule your time, because that's your life, but schedule the life you want. That means you have to schedule your responsibilities obviously, because responsibilities are those things that ruin your life if you don't fulfill them. Learn to use a calendar, like Google Calendar. Many of you out there do not use a calendar. Okay, a calendar is not a prison, and it's not a tyrant, not if you use it properly. A calendar keeps anxiety at bay. It makes sure that you do what you need to do, which is important, because otherwise you fall behind. But if you use it properly, it's also helps you plan what you want to do. So I could say, well, lay out your damn calendar and design the days you would like to have. That's what your calendar is for. So you can put in all sorts of things in there you want to do, and that would be good for you. And that's a really good way to start being more industrious. Make a plan. You need a plan for 3 years. You need a plan for the next year. You need a plan for the next 6 months. You need a plan for the next 3 months. You need a plan for the week. You need a plan for the day. You need a plan for the hour. All of that. I make lists constantly of what I have to do. And they're like daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. I've asked my undergraduates frequently how much time they waste per day, and general estimates are like 6 to 8 hours of time they regard themselves as wasting. Like, that's a whole career right there, right? So if you just stop wasting time, you can do a tremendous amount, especially if you also try to maximize efficiency. And I always found that incredibly motivating. A motivating game. How much can I do in the least amount of time possible? That's fun to try to do that, as far as I'm concerned. I know, that's maybe undoubtedly a temperamental thing, but if you're wired that way, that's a great meta strategy. Become efficient. I always asked my graduate students when they were designing experiments, they'd come with a proposal. I'd say to them, is there any way you could do this 10 times faster? What would you have to cut? What would you have to change to do this 10 times faster? And you can learn to do that. I also learned to force the task to fit the time. There's this dictum, work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Well, there's a corollary to that, which is work becomes more efficient in proportion to the restrictions of time placed upon it. So if you say, well, this could take me 2 weeks, but I'm going to do the best job I could in 1 day, you'd be amazed. You can get 90% of the way, or 95% of the way, or sometimes even farther in that day. So that's another way of becoming efficient. If you only have 10 minutes to do something that should maybe take you 2 hours, maybe you can figure out how to do it in 10 minutes. You can get dreadfully efficient. So that's very much worthwhile, in my estimation. If you want to do a lot of things, what else are you going to do? Rather than become efficient, if you want to do many things, you don't have much choice. But I found it extremely entertaining to try to do that.
were to pick, 3 rules for life that would lead you down a better path, what would they be?
Well, I think not saying things you know to be untrue. That's a good thing. Don't lie. That's good. Be grateful. And then try to work for the best in yourself and other people. And maybe even broader than that. Try to work for the best, despite your cynicism and resentment. I suppose that's a form of gratitude as well. That's what love means fundamentally, is working for the best of things. And it's a goal. I mean, what's the alternative? Hate? And that's not going to make things better. It's going to make things worse. Oh, generally speaking. So something like truth nested inside of love. Then there's gratitude lurking around the edges. Beauty is important.
More art, right?
Yeah, well, more beauty, period. Everywhere. That would be nice. It's kind of intimidating, beauty.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, because it's an ideal. It judges you. This is something that's quite interesting, is every ideal is a judge. Right? Because
by
you
nature.
Fall short of it. Yeah, but it's an interesting problem that you need an ideal to work towards, but the consequence of that is that you're judged by it.
That's fascinating, because we always want the ideal, right?
Yeah, well, I recommend it to people that they try to reward themselves for improving over who they were yesterday, rather than punishing themselves for their deviation from the ideal. Look for incremental improvements and let yourself know that you've managed them.
Is it important to hold the ideal, but also then keep short-term goals of
you definitely.
Against yourself?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, you want to break it down into, and then you do this with kids too. You want to set someone a task that will stretch them beyond their limit, but not be impossible, right? So that's part of being intelligent and careful within a relationship, because it'd be nice to facilitate success. I mean, maybe it has to be punctuated by failure from time to time, but that's one of the things you do as a therapist, is try to set things up so that people succeed in moving towards their goals, and try to make the tasks small enough so that they're a reasonable probability that they will be completed successfully. Well, so we live inside a damaged structure, and we also bear responsibility for that damage, because we don't do everything we can to constantly repair it. And you might say, well, that's actually one of the fundamental, people say, well, what's the meaning of life? What they really mean is, what's the positive meaning of life? Because as we've already discussed, the negative meanings of life are more or less self-evident. Well, the positive meaning of life is to be found in noting the state of lack of repair of the walled city that you inhabit, and then sallying forth to do something about that, to repair the breaches and to fix up the walls and to make the structure that you inhabit as secure and as productive as it possibly can be. And there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind. You can do that in your own room. You can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. And so there's challenges. That's the thing that's kind of interesting about this insufficient structure, is that it has a set of challenges built into it because of its insufficiency, and perhaps even because of its corrupt nature, that calls forth the potential response from you of heroic adventure. And the heroic adventure is to man the barricades and repair the city. And you can always do that. It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. And one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the idea that if you adopt an attitude that's like that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are in all sorts of ways, and that we've really, as a species, you might say, or maybe even as singular individuals, we've explored that rarely. It isn't something that's put forth as a proposition that often, and it's quite surprising to me. And I had an interesting experience the other day. I went to the keg. I go there because I have food allergies, and they're very careful with people who have food allergies. And the waiter took me to the table, and he said that he had been watching my lectures, and that's a very common experience. And he was happy about that, and he said that he'd had 2 promotions at the keg in the last 4 months because he'd been watching my lectures. And I really found that an affecting experience, because you might say, well, he's working as a waiter at the keg and there's nothing particularly heroic about that, and I disagree with that, actually, because I don't care where you're located, you can do a hell of a job, and I mean that literally. At whatever job you have, you can take whatever job you have and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously, and you can say, well, I happen to be a waiter at the keg, and perhaps that's not what I expected, and he's a young guy, and perhaps that isn't where I want to end up, but it's not nothing. It's a rich environment, and I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back, and I can treat my customers properly, and if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it, and I can see what happens. And so he said that's what he'd started doing, and that things were working out much better for him. He was in a much better job than he was 3 months ago. In 3 months, that's nothing, right? I mean, that's a nice trajectory. It's an uphill trajectory, and that's what you want, really. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good, as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. And so I get a lot of letters from people like that, and they're most frequently young men, although not always. And they say, well, I've been listening to these lectures, and I decided that I'm going to try to take responsibility for my life, and so I've started to stop doing all the stupid things that I know that are stupid, that I know I shouldn't be doing, and I've started doing some of the things that aren't stupid that I know I should be doing, which seems pretty obvious, really, if you think about it. But obvious though it may be, that isn't necessarily what people do. And then they write and say, you can't believe what difference that makes. And they're thrilled about it. And so I'm thrilled about it when I get letters like that, because I really don't experience anything as better than a letter like that or a message like that, because it's so good to see things that aren't so good replaced by something better. And I really do think it's an open question. I truly believe it's an open question to what degree we could make things better if that's what we actually aimed at doing. My sense, and I did a lot of clinical work with high-performing people and had a chance to observe them in academia among my peers, but also, and among graduate students, but also in the broader business and professional world. And it takes a singular combination of traits to be a C-suite person or the equivalent. And one thing is incredible efficiency and persistence. So not only are you working 80 hours a week, you do that all the time, and you do it non-stop. So it's not like, you talk to an undergraduate and he says, or she says, I spent 8 hours in the library yesterday studying, and then you do a little microanalysis and you find out that really they spent 40 minutes studying maybe, and 7.5 hours wasting time. But the people that occupy those C-suite positions, they're actually working all that time, and they've trained them. Well, they have the temperament, they're very likely to be conscientious, so they start with that. And perhaps that was also fostered in their household, because that does help. So here's an example of that. So the children of first-generation Asian immigrants are disproportionately successful. And it looks like the reason for that is something like socialization for conscientiousness And that seems to produce the equivalent of about a 15-point IQ advantage, which is about the difference between the typical college graduate and the typical university or high school graduate. It's a big difference. It's a big, one standard deviation. So, to be a CEO or to be hyper successful, you have to be, let's say, 2 to 3 standard deviations or more above the mean for IQ. So that wipes out like 85% of the population right off the bat, or 95% really. And then you have to be in the 95th percentile for conscientiousness, and those are uncorrelated. So that's 5% of 5% with the first 2 cuts. So there's a singular personalities that end up in those situations. And I think, that there's an added advantage that men have motivationally to pursue those jobs. And the advantage is that status confers upon males sexual attractiveness, status within the patriarchal hierarchy, let's say. So women are much more likely to choose high status men, assuming that the definition of status is defined by the hierarchy within which they're competing. Okay. Men have zero preference for women who are high status in that way. Or actually the correlation is slightly negative. And so to be a CEO and be a woman means that you have to have all those personality attributes, but then you don't gain this tremendous reproductive advantage. And I think that advantage is so marked that it's actually built into men. It's not only motivating consciously, if I'm successful, I'll be more successful with women. It's built in biologically.
Well, and you want status among your fellow males too, like athletes compete against each other, and you want to get the respect of your fellow males, say in your group. At least, I mean, speaking as a male.
Look, I had this roommate. He came from Alberta like me, so he was a small town rural guy, and he went to McGill and then went off to New York. He's very, very smart. Rough guy, very adventurous guy, went off to New York, became a corporate lawyer. And his plan was to go to New York, make a pile of money, and then go travel. Like he went up the Amazon, he went into China when so few Caucasians had gone there that they had to put him in jail in one part of China because he got mobbed so badly. It was the only place, because people were curious about him, it was the only place they could put him that was safe. So in any case, he was going to go to New York and make a bunch of money and then be his adventurous self. But, you go to New York and you adopt a job, one of those high pressure jobs in a top law firm, and the socialization pressure is so intense, you've never experienced anything like it in your life. And if you do that for 10 years, you're a corporate lawyer. You're not whoever you were to begin with. Maybe the conscientiousness remains. And so I saw him about 15 years later. And it was so funny because when he walked into the restaurant, he had a high-powered New York suit on. He was a really sharp-looking guy. And he looked the part exactly. And I thought, geez, I look just like a professor because I had my tweed jacket on and my leather jacket. I was much more casual. And I thought, we really became what we pursued. And so these trade-offs that you talk about, they're real, right? They're real. You sacrifice much of what you could be for who you are going to be. And that's a good sacrifice because you should become something, but it's still a real sacrifice. I know a bunch of people who run MBA programs, and I've had discussions with them because the thing about an MBA program is if it's selective, it's really hard to get in. It's like getting into Harvard. It's really hard to get into Harvard. You have to have an IQ that places you at least at the 99th percentile, and then you have to be really good at least one or two other things. So it's really hard to get in. Okay, so you think, well, why hire a Harvard graduate? Well, it's the quality of the education. It's like, no, it's not. It's the fact that it's really hard to get in. All of the value of the Ivy League education is in the screening before the education starts. Now, that doesn't mean that people go to Harvard and they get educated, but they'd get just as educated if they went somewhere else. First of all, it's like every university contains more information than any student can ever possibly process. If you're super smart, you can be dropped into a state college somewhere, a low-level state college. You just spend 4 years in the library. Like, what are you going to do? Read the whole library? No. Right. So, and the data on this is quite clear. It's like, and it's the same with private schools. The reason that people who go to private schools do better than people who go to public schools is because, generally speaking, the people who go into private schools are smarter. It's not the education that's any better. And so we radically overestimate the degree to which training works. So now you can train people to be stupid. But training them to be smarter than they are is really, really, really hard. So, like I said, it's a dismal literature. And the liberals think everyone's roughly equal and there's a job for everyone, you just have to train them. It's like, no, wrong. And the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone if they just get off their ass and work. It's like, no, that's wrong too. Even though, if you work, that's better. And, well, so that's on the conservative end, but the liberals won't take into account individual differences. Well, obviously, that's part of what the whole politically correct discussion is about. It's like, everyone's the same. It's like, yeah, they're not. And I find it's really annoying, I would say. Like, I love to come to Silicon Valley. I've been here many, many times, and like, it's really something to come here and meet. There's so many people here who are off the scales intelligent, and they're all, clustered together, which is why this place is so unbelievably rich and so unbelievably productive, one of the reasons. But it's also very annoying that it's so left-leaning, because one of the things that the left-leaning Silicon Valley geniuses should understand is that they're the beneficiary of a genetic lottery. Mm-hmm. And they should take that seriously. It's like, yeah, you worked hard. Yes, you're entrepreneurial. Yes, you're on point. You put in your 60 hours a week. You do everything you could. But you have an IQ of 150. And like, that's not your doing, mm-hmm. right? That's something that happened to you. And so you can't be saying, well, it's all me. It's like, no, It's not. It's all you and the genius that you were granted as an infant. That's it. That's what's driving it. Now, that doesn't mean, I think, that people of disproportionate intelligence shouldn't be rewarded disproportionately. It's possible that they should, because it might be in the best interest of everyone else to dump as much money as possible to the top 2% of the cognitive strata, because they're going to be most generative with it. And so, and even if it's not fair, because you might say, well, just because you won the genetic lottery, does that mean that you should have more money than anyone else? It's like, well, not on the grounds of fairness. But if you have to distribute money, well, who are you going to distribute it to? And I think, was it Ted, who ran CNN? Ted Turner. Mm-hmm. He estimated that if you tried as hard as you could in your entire life, there was no way that you could spend more than $400 million. And so let's say you have more money than that at your disposal. Well, hopefully you're going to do some halfway intelligent things with it, and hopefully you'd expect that the more intelligent people would do more than halfway intelligent things with it. So if you have to have unequal distribution, then a meritocracy is probably the best way to do it. But it still leaves you with this terrible problem, which is, what do you do with all the people who stack up at zero? And the answer isn't have contempt for them because they don't work as hard as you. It's like, yeah, a bunch of them don't, because conscientiousness also predicts success. So among the poor, there are people who don't work, but you never want to underestimate the contribution of cognitive ability. So it's rough, man, and we don't take it seriously, and we don't know what to do about it. And it's clear that as inequality increases, societies destabilize. That's clear. So it's something that has to be dealt with, but we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to efficiently move resources to the bottom end of the competence hierarchy. And I've worked with people, lots of people who are at the bottom end of the hierarchy in my clinical practice, and like cocaine addicts, for example, low IQ cocaine addicts. Not all cocaine addicts have low IQ, by the way, but it's just it's a triple whammy, let's say, because if you're a cocaine addict, you're probably also an alcoholic. And so if you're a cocaine addict and you're an alcoholic and you're sort of on the low end of the cognitive distribution, it's like you have a pretty damn rough life. There's a lot of things going wrong for you, and you're really lucky if you're flat broke, because as soon as you get money, you are so done, you cannot believe it. So like, when your unemployment check comes in and you're a cocaine addict alcoholic who isn't employed, the probability that 3 days later you're going to end up face down in a ditch is really, really high. So don't be thinking like it's not so simple that you can just dump money down the competence hierarchy to the people who are in the underclass and expect that that's going to have a salutary effect. I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. Like, money is not an easy resource to use productively.
Responsibility, I think, is an incredible message.
Yeah, the responsibility element has been well received by people, and I think maybe that's because that message isn't being delivered as effectively as it should be. The idea that meaning is to be found in responsibility.
Yeah, you're saying it hasn't been developed. You're saying it hasn't been promoted as much.
Well, there's so much of an emphasis on rights. I mean, imagine if our culture was as dominated by discussion of responsibility as it was dominated by discussion of rights.
Gosh,
Be
right.
completely. I mean, that's just not how it is at all.
Right.
And that's strange because your rights, in some sense, are my responsibility, and vice versa. So, right, because your accorded rights, it's distance from other people in some sense. And for them, it's the same. And so you can't have one discussion without the other.
Mm-hmm.
But our discussion has been very one-sided. And I think that's hard on people because it's about what you're owed.
Yeah.
And it isn't obvious to me that, I don't know, it's not like not getting what you're owed isn't annoying. It is if you feel that an injustice has been committed. But
right.
It isn't obvious to me that people find the deepest meaning in their life in getting what they're owed. I really do think that people find more significance in their life in being of utility and service to other people. That's how it looks to me. So, and often that's discussed in a sort of should way, you should be good to other people. It's like, well, your life is better if you do that. That's a different way of putting it. And you can get people to think about that. It's like, well, remember those times when people were particularly happy with something that you did, something for them. How did you feel about that? Well, you can figure that out for yourself. Maybe it didn't matter, but probably it mattered. Probably you'd like to have that happen a lot more.
But I think even more so, the feeling that you get when you have a responsibility and you deliver on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, for me, that feels even more meaningful, that you uphold your end of the bargain, that you make someone's life better. That feels even better than when someone says, thank you for that. Thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, absolutely. No, I wasn't thinking so much about the consequences of the thanks. Yeah. That's just an indication that you did something, that was productive and useful and caring, let's say. And yeah, And I think people know that too, that when they're operating properly, parents find tremendous meaning in the service they provide to their children, obviously. And I think you find that within a relationship, what you give. I mean, it's reciprocal, obviously. There has to be reciprocity, but it's better to concentrate at least half the time on what you're giving. I don't think that young people, especially in later days in junior high school, maybe even earlier than that, are taught enough to think about what they want and how they would go about getting it. And I mean what they want in a deep sense, like how their friendships could be better, how their relationships with their parents could be better, how their life could be better, practically speaking. So we tried to design a program to help younger people do the self-authoring program, but my health interfered with that and it fell by the wayside, unfortunately. But it's helpful for people to take stock of themselves and to chart a course. And I don't think our education system does a very good job of helping people develop a vision of themselves, a story for themselves. And it's a problem because it also means that they're not ennobled or encouraged the way they should be. And I've seen this all constantly during my lectures, that people are so happy to be encouraged. They're often met with skepticism instead, and I think that's part of the problem with what's happening in our culture politically too, is that there's this terrible critique of our culture that all its institutions are fundamentally predicated on arbitrary power, the exercise of arbitrary power. And that implies that the ambitions of people who wish to join that culture and to thrive are expressions of tyrannical, oppressive, arbitrary power. It's very demoralizing to young people. And I don't believe it's true, because I don't think the fundamental motivation is to exploit others. I think that people who do that fail, generally speaking, often precipitously. Societies that organize themselves around that principle are miserable and collapse. They're full of deceit and backstabbing and distrust. It's hell. And so I think that young people are best encouraged. And that means that you actually have to sort of like them. Like you're a mentor. It's like, I'm on the side of the good in you, and I hope it manifests itself. And I think that's what trust is for, by the way. You should trust other people. Why? They can bite. Why would you trust them? Well, because it's courageous to. And that way you elicit the best from them. At least that's the best opportunity you have. You're going to get hurt sometime. You're going to get hurt distrusting too. But societies without trust are hell on earth. So
trusting
that's for sure.
Next generation, though, starts with you having it in the first place, right? That's sort of passing along those patterns. As if I don't trust anyone, I'm going to instill that in my child. Like, the world's not to be trusted.
You can try to change that, and if you know that trust is courage, that can help. Because, trust can be just naivety. I trust you because I'm too foolish to know the difference. I've never been hurt. I've never encountered someone malevolent, so I'm naive. And I trust. That's not trust. That's blind faith in an environment that's been too benevolent for your own good. But trust, that's more like, we'll think the best of you to begin with and see what happens. And then if you make a mistake, we'll deal with that and we'll go back to trust. And those are stable negotiating strategies. And so young people need to be confronted with that, and then they need to be helped to chart their course. And that's hard. It takes a fair bit of individual attention because people are so complicated. I produce this other technology at self-authoring that helps people write about their past, analyze their faults and their virtues, and write a plan for the future. It's a useful way of figuring out who you are. You kind of have to hit yourself against the world, but you tell the story about your past, and that helps you understand where you came from. You figure out your virtues and your faults. That sort of helps you understand your strengths and weaknesses. And then a plan gives you a course for the future. It's hard to do all that writing, but it's hard to blunder through life too without a plan. So it's hard either way.
Pick your hard. You always talk about that. Choose the difficult, or the difficult will choose you eventually, and you might not like it as much, right?
Yeah, when it's necessary. Like, I wouldn't say to go out of your way necessarily to make your life difficult, but if you have a difficult choice in front of you and it's either abandon what you should be doing or do the difficult thing, you're going to pay a price for abandonment. So, and I guess I would also say that to understand yourself, it's quite useful to try to not lie, because you tangle yourself up in your own lies. People think they can get away with lying, but you can't get away with falsifying the structure of the world. You're going to pay for it. I've never seen anybody get away with anything in my clinical practice. No, the other shoe always dropped. Always, always. And unsurprisingly, if you drop a weight on your head, above your head, like it's fine until it hits you. Yeah.
But then there's changing your mind.
Yeah, there you can be wrong. That's different. That's a good point, though. It's difficult to dissociate ignorance from lying, but, you get punished when you're wrong often, but that's different, It's not like it's nothing to be ignorant, to be wrong. It's still hard on you, but it's a different kind of hard to be willfully wrong. One of the real advantages, I think a lot of the current political movements are quasi-religions, essentially, and religious structures have collapsed very badly, and so these things arise to take their place because we need a religious structure, because that's what provides us with our fundamental story. The fundamental story of life is a religious story, by definition. That's what I mean by that. Is the most fundamental story you have is the closest thing you have to a religion. So
we started there. We started with the stories.
Yes. Well, and metaphysics be damned, but I don't know what the fundamental significance of consciousness is, and neither does anybody else. So there's plenty of room for metaphysical speculation. It's hard to know what each person's destiny is, but in any case, the problem with so many ideological stories is that they give you an easy enemy. And that's extremely dangerous. And maybe the enemy, they always give you an enemy. Yeah, that's a real problem.
So that seems like one of the biggest problems, is there's always an enemy.
Well, the biggest problem is the enemy isn't you. You're your worst enemy.
I agree.
That's the right place to start. And so, one of the advantages, I think, of Christianity, although I don't think it's limited to Christianity, is that it insists that that's the battleground. You. Right? And so if you need an enemy, and maybe you do, look within. Part of your goal, if you want to take your place in the hierarchy properly, is to be a good person. And that was the argument I was trying to make in the chapter. Not that you're supposed to be like the most brutal crustacean on the block. It's so foolish. It was Kathy Newman, I think, that asked me in the UK. So you're saying that human society should be organized along the lines of lobsters. It's like, look, lady, if you're gonna insult someone, you might want to try accusing them of believing something that someone somewhere believed at least once in the entire history of the human race. And not that. Yes, absolutely. Lobsters for everyone. What I was trying to make the case was that we have this very old system in our nervous systems, which is very old, which keeps track of where we are in hierarchies, and that regulates our emotions because of it, because it's really important to you and you and you and you. If you're not completely bloody psychopathic, that you have a place in a social hierarchy and that you're admired and respected and valued by other people. And it's so important that the neurochemical system that keeps track of that regulates your other emotions, so that if you're low on the totem pole because, well, for whatever the reason happens to be, sometimes you deserve it, sometimes it's accidental, sometimes you've been hurt. There's lots of ways that this can happen. Your serotonin levels plummet like a defeated lobster, and then you feel way more negative emotion about everything and way less positive emotion about everything. And that's absolutely dreadful. Like that's clinical depression, and it's a terrible, terrible condition. And so it's absolutely crucial that you maintain a tenable position in a hierarchy, and not one of power, but one of competence. And at least even if you're not in a position that's tenable, you're moving upward towards one that's tenable, because that at least gives you hope. Because maybe you're young and useless and you don't know what the hell you're doing. You're just getting started. And so you're low man on the totem pole, but it's not like you're stuck there forever. You do some decent work. I had some kid tell me the other day, it was really nice. God, I was in a rough shape 2 years ago. I was just getting married. I just got married, and I was nihilistic as hell and depressed and bitter, and things weren't going well for me at all. And and I was unemployed, and one of my friends got me a job. And he said, I didn't really like the bloody job. I didn't want to have the job. And I was kind of dragging my ass to the work and not doing it well. And I listened to one of your lectures, and it said, look, if you haven't got anything going for you, but you have a job, don't quit your job. Whether you hate it or not, it's like, man, that's what you're hanging on to the edge of the world with your fingertips, you know? Don't let go. Well, if you can find a better job, okay, fine. But you don't just quit, because then what? You're done. Another thing that I had mentioned was, why don't you just try to work as hard as you can at your damn job for like 6 weeks, right? All flat out. You know, if you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. That's something worth thinking about. You know, you've got a job, maybe you show up 15 minutes early and you leave 15 minutes late. You know, and you actually work and your boss notices, because he would probably notice, and then maybe someone's going to get promoted and maybe it'll be you, because something's going to tilt the scales, and that little extra bit of work done without cynicism and resentment might be enough. Well, he said he started at $21 an hour, and in 6 weeks he was making $37 an hour. And it's not a king's ransom, man, but it's a hell of a lot more than zero, and it's quite a lot more than 21. He said his life had turned around substantially because he learned if he put some damn effort into it. And I'm not trying to be Joe Optimist here. Like, I know that people hit runs of bad luck, and that things can take you out of life, right? Unfortunate illnesses and betrayal, and like there's no shortage of randomness and horror that can wipe you out even if you're doing your best. But you don't have a better bloody plan than to do your best, and it tends to work a lot better than you think. And what's so interesting about the hierarchies that people set up is that that's how they're set up. They're not set up on power. They're set up on reciprocity and skill and trust. Not always. You know, and if you're in a job where you work hard and you're a good guy and you're doing your best and your boss is a bloody tyrant and you never get a break, it's like, okay, fine. You're in a Foucault world. Get the hell out of it. You know, you get your resume set up, write your CV, fill in the educational gaps that you have, send out your 25 resumes a day, and prepare to make a lateral move, because you're in a bad place. But almost everywhere, and this has certainly been the case virtually everywhere I've worked, and I've had like 50 jobs, you know, if you go above and beyond the call of duty in an awake and intelligent way, interpersonally, socially, with regards to the diligence of your work, with regards to the truth of your attitude and your courage and all of that, that will work. And you know, if you try it for a year and it doesn't work, then go somewhere else, because you can, right? You're free. I mean, it's not easy. You can't just walk out the door and instantly find another job, but you're not enslaved. You could make a move. You could even decide that you're going to make a move and double your salary. You know, it's not a bad goal, and it's certainly a possibility. It's like, it isn't hierarchy. It's ethics that determines success in a functional society. It's ethics that determines success, not power. The rest of it's a bloody lie. And that doesn't mean that all our systems are perfectly ethical. You know, you got to be awake. If you're in a system, there's going to be some corruption in it. Part of what you're supposed to do is keep your damn eyes open for the corruption and your mouth speaking truth. So when the corruption... starts to take root, you object to it so the whole damn system doesn't turn into a pathological power play. And that's part of your ethical responsibility as a conscious being, an ethical being, a religious being for that matter, and a citizen, you know? And you're charged with that. That's why you vote. That's why you're the cornerstone of your state, man. You're the what would you call? You're the wellspring of the ethical actions that replenish the dying world. That's what you are. And if you act, that's what you are. And if you act that out properly, then things work. And that's why that's always been described as ethical behavior. It's not because you're supposed to be good, and being good isn't that easy anyways. And it certainly doesn't mean being nice and harmless. It's not an easy thing to be good. You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. And that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you. Plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. It's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. The people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. And I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. And what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent, the possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in stir qualinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror